Good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Wes Daniels and the director of Friends Center, and I'm really glad to have our JM Ward Distinguished Quaker Visitor, Ben Pink Dandelion, with us this evening. Woohoo! Ben comes all the way from England, and he got here yesterday, so he may, I don't know if your spirit has caught up with your body yet, but anyways, we invited Ben to come, and he's been on campus all day. He taught in one of our classes and spoke at our college meeting for worship this afternoon, and it's been a delight having him on campus. Tomorrow from 11:30 to 1 p.m., Ben will be in the atrium of the cafeteria and continuing to just have conversations. So you're welcome to join us there. Tonight, Ben's going to be talking about being Quaker, being transformed. And how many of you are familiar with some of Ben's work, or all of Ben's work, maybe? Okay. Did you bring the stack of books to have him sign afterwards? I became acquainted with Ben when I started thinking about doing PhD work. And if you Google, Quaker and then pretty much any other subject, Ben pops up in Google. And I found out that Ben does a lot of work with PhD students and master's students at Woodbrook Quaker Study Center. And so I had an opportunity to work with him while I was doing my PhD. He's written on many topics, from sort of your introduction to Quakerism to more sociological studies of specifically liberal friends. And he's written some really helpful stuff on the understanding of the testimonies and all sorts of other things. So I think besides just his wealth of knowledge, he is a very warm and wonderful person to be with. He is very committed to his meeting and active there, and does lots of practical things like fixing roofs and plumbing and things like that. So he's an all-around great guy, and I'm glad to have him here. Let's have him come up and give him our attention.
Well, thank you, Wes, and thank you, everyone, for inviting me here this evening. I've had the total service. I've had the water here. The sound's been put on. Thank you very much. And 2 minutes ago, we decided what I was talking about, so that's lovely. So, and if you fall asleep, I'll have every sympathy, and if I'll maybe just sort of cough in your direction, and if it happens to me, just cough in my direction. It'll be fine. And it'll just be the jet lag. It won't be anything personal. So, good. Well, a couple of years ago now. No, it was a year ago. It's just been a long year. I was asked to give the Swarthmore Lecture in Britain Yearly Meeting, which is the annual lecture they have at the time of the yearly meeting. And this was slightly daunting because for about the last 20 years I've been talking about Quakers and doing lots of academic work and talking about mainly them and they, even whilst being a Quaker. And the Swarthmore Lecture is meant to feed the spiritual life of the yearly meeting, Britain Yearly Meeting. And I had to kind of come off my academic fence and say things that were far more personal. And there's been a whole kind of reaction to that. And, because one of the interesting things that happens is that people tend, especially because I like to just sort of go like a twig on the ocean and smooth the waters, and so everyone tends to think I believe whatever they do. And so there was always sort of reaction, but how could you say that? I mean, that's not what we thought you were saying, and all this kind of stuff. So I felt rather exposed this last year, but at the same time, it's been a powerful experience because I've managed to combine my academic work and my spiritual life with far greater integrity. And I think it's a process that's been happening, and it's certainly been nurtured by my visits to the United States, where it's far easier actually to talk about religion than it is in Britain, which is very, very secular, and where even within Quakerism we tend not to say too much that's too explicit. So, okay, I'll get back to that. So, and I was asked to give this lecture, and a committee discerns your name, and they rang up and they said, we've had a meeting today, and your name popped up, or popped down, and how about giving the Swarthmore lecture in 2014, about 2 years before, because they discern ahead. And so I just said, yes, okay. And they said, that was a bit quick. I said, well, you said you discerned, and if you've been faithfully discerning, then there seems to be, okay. And then you go and meet the committee, and there's about 14 people sitting around the table. And they say, this is, they give you a topic, and the topic was what it means to be a Quaker. Okay. And they said, the important thing is this is your lecture. We've discerned your name, and this is your lecture. We want you talk about what you feel led to talk about. Okay. But we want to see a draft and a synopsis, and the second draft is due a year later, and we'll all be looking at that. So anyway, but we went round the room, and I said, it's your lecture. And of the 14 people, they had 14 preferred angles. Well, I'd really like you to include something on global Quakerism. Well, could you say something about 20 years of teaching at Woodbrook and reflect on what you've learned that way? And the history of early friends, really important that you mention that, because it's your lecture. So I gave a synopsis, and I said, it's probably going to be about transformation. I said, okay. Your lecture. Okay. So, and then I set aside a month. So most of my working week, I live in the north of England by Pendle Hill, and then I travel down by train to Woodbrook, which is in Birmingham, and I spend a couple of nights there. And I thought, well, for this, I'm really going to need to set some time aside, immerse myself in profound worship and thought, and I will go up to the top of the house where I will be undisturbed, and I shall be able to lean back for profound wisdom and lean forward to type. Well, two things got in the way of this. The first was, I won't go on too long because I know we lost a cat at the previous Christmas, and there was a moment where my wonderful and fantastic, and who I'm missing greatly, wife Wendy, said to our daughter Florence, well, we're all very upset about this cat, but maybe we could get a dog. And I'm sitting there at dinner and I'm thinking, what? Maybe we could get... that's not like a maybe kind of statement, is it? And once you've said, maybe we could get a dog, that's really saying we can get a dog. Florence, who is fantastic as well and absolutely amazing, within seconds had left the room. She was upstairs to the Encyclopedia of Dogs. Down it came, the 10 preferred breeds, and she had a whole spreadsheet laid out on a big bit of paper. Longevity, known health problems, degree of care, friendliness with children. So, and within about 10 minutes it was chosen. Well, the arrival of the puppy, to cut a long story short, coincided with my month at home to write this lecture. Well, because what do you want to do with a puppy? Well, you need to get it house trained. So, and the thing about every hour, basically, take the puppy out. Or after any meal, take the puppy out. Or after any moment of excitement, take the puppy out. Okay? It did indeed work. Within 9 days, this lovely bundle of fluff was house trained. But it wasn't very helpful. What it meant was that I was downstairs on the hour, or after any meal or a moment of excitement, so sometimes combined. Anyway, and so, this whole idea of immersing myself upstairs, and the other thing that happened is, amazingly, and for the first time only, I had really terrible food poisoning, and I won't go into details because, but sometimes it was me going outside with the puppy, and sometimes I was going outside on my own, and And then realising I had to come back for the puppy because I couldn't leave the puppy behind. Anyway, so admittedly the first draft was rather scrappy. It was slightly all over the place. It wasn't the kind of beautiful, polished bit of... And the committee really didn't like it at all, even though it was your lecture. And luckily I was with Deborah at the time at Pendle Hill, and I got 8 pages of really strong, positive... well, it wasn't positive. Anyway, anyway, eventually this thing came through. By the second draft, they were a bit happier, and by the third draft, the 2 people appointed to read the third draft were so busy they didn't even bother. And the fourth draft, I just made it up. So, anyway, so that's called co-option by exhaustion. You just exhaust the committee, and eventually they don't care what you put in it. So, anyway. But the funny thing, what puzzled me was that we had a 3-year exercise in Britain Yearly Meeting, which, for those who don't know, is probably one of the most liberal yearly meetings. Really very diverse, very permissive in terms of belief. We'd had a 3-year exercise on what it means to be a Quaker, and this lecture was part of the final 3rd year. And I puzzled over this, and I thought, why would a yearly meeting need to have 3 years on what it means to be a Quaker? I mean, anyone looking in would be surely puzzled by this. The Quakers are discussing what it means to be a Quaker. Well, don't they know? And of course, in some curious way, liberal Quakers, and particularly kind of very permissive liberal Quakers that we find in Britain, perhaps don't know what it means to be a Quaker, because we've lost that sense of certainty about where the boundaries are, and indeed where even the centre of faith lies. So for 20 or 30 years in Britain, we've not been talking very much about our faith, and we've tended to hedge round what then becomes kind of an eggshell issue. In 1980s, 1990s, it was about whether you were Christocentric or universalist, and now it's like whether you're a theist or a non-theist. And these debates are rumbling on in Britain. And there's a non-theist friends network. A non-theist itself is like a really unhelpful kind of term, I think, because partly it's a non-term, and also that group incorporates a huge range of positions, from people who have a problem with the word God, but have a very clear and rich spiritual life, through to people who don't want God, but, or are not quite sure, maybe in a kind of optimistic, agnostic position, to dedicated humanists. And so it's a very broad kind of coalition. And what it's done is it's defined a theist position out, even though nobody's actually calling themselves a theist. So there isn't a theist group, there's just a non-theist group, and there's everyone else sort of standing around the outside, not quite sure really where they are. So, and not necessarily calling themselves a theist. So it seems that indeed Britain Yearly Meeting did need to think about what it meant to be a Quaker, because we had lost that sense. We were still doing things in the same way, but what was actually going on, such as worshipping in silence, but what was actually going on for people was much less clear. So I came up with 4 things that I thought we really defined what it was to be a Quaker. And I would go as far as saying that we could probably draw this list out across global Quakerism, but with different emphases. Excuse me. Okay. So the first thing is that at the heart of Quakerism is this sense of direct encounter with, in British terms, whatever it is we might want to call it that's beyond the material. Spirit, divine, God, the holy, the mystery. And we can go right back to 1647 and George Fox's foundational experience, that amazing moment where he's taken from being in a great sense of despair, with nothing outwardly to help him, his hopes in all men gone, to hearing this voice, which said, there is one, even Christ Jesus, that can speak to thy condition. And he writes in his journal, and when I heard it, my heart did leap for joy. And I saw why there were none upon the earth that might speak to my condition, namely that I might give him all the glory. So there's this very clear sense that there can be this direct connection with God. And really the whole of Quakerism is based on that. You know, we worship in a particular way, in whatever tradition we are, because we want to nurture that encounter, that spiritual experience. We act out of that experience of revelation. We believe we can be guided daily in our lives through that direct encounter. We have said over the years that we don't need outward sacraments, outward, separated priesthood, even a Christian calendar. These are all outward forms that other Christians use, but they're not things that are necessary or essential to the Quaker faith. Quakerism is set up on a set of rather grand claims. A lot of things that we don't think we need. Okay. Or you could call it arrogant, but let's just call it grand. So we have that direct encounter. And for any faith that's based on revelation, what's then really important is that we then understand when we're in that space, in that intimacy with God. So the second element is that we've become very practiced at discernment. And discernment is absolutely essential for a group whose authority is rooted in revelation. Right? There's no book we can turn to, as our primary authority. We're turning inward to God, and then we need to check that we are actually doing that authentically and not just imagining whatever we want. So I do love wheels and things with wheels. I've been fairly open about this over the years, and often I've seen an advertisement and exclaimed, "It's a sign, look at this! Wow, it's got those letters in the number plate, it must be one for me." And my wife wisely says, Wendy says, "Well, you often see a sign when you want to." So we need to know when something is authentically from God. And over the centuries, we've become very practiced at discernment. We have good processes. We have refined our Quaker business method, our clearness committees, and we know that we kind of need 24-hour clearness committees on our shoulder for our daily discerning. But we've become practiced at discerning in our personal and in our collective lives. So the third element would be then we do indeed have a form of worship that nurtures that sense of encounter, whether it's unprogrammed or programmed. That the point of our worship is to nurture that direct sense of encounter, that intimacy with God. So, whether it's an hour or an hour and a half of silence, or 3 hours as early friends had and some meetings are now experimenting with again, or 20 minutes of communion after the manner of friends, surrounded by things that help nurture that open worship. And the fourth element is that we have a way of life that comes out of that spiritual experience. What we would call testimony. And I tend to put it in the singular because I think it's one life, even though it will incorporate different aspects of our spiritual values. That we can't have an encounter with the divine and not be changed by it. That we are sent out into the world, called to change things around us. And over the centuries, we've tried to do that as a faith group. We've campaigned for peace, we've campaigned for social justice, and we keep doing that. So those are the four elements. It's encounter, discernment, worship, and witness, or testimony. And there's just a few things to say about that list. The first is that in a liberal Quaker context, that list is very thin on doctrine. Okay, so in Britain, we don't, define the sort of the doctrinal side of Quakerism. We're rather hesitant about theology generally. We believe it's a sort of towards kind of activity. And I'd say this would be true of all liberal friends. That we're very perhaps about our theology. We wouldn't imagine we'd got the final truth for all people for all time. But that we're somehow moving towards it. And what's interesting about liberal friends is that we're very sure about that. That we're pretty absolutist about being perhaps. And so we're kind of fundamental. We're absolutely certain that we will necessarily be a little bit uncertain theologically. Okay? That the religious enterprise isn't something we imagine we can just sew up neatly. Now, of course, elsewhere in the Quaker world, that's not true at all. And we get very clear statements of doctrine. But in a liberal Quaker setting, it's low on doctrine and high on shared practice. So there's the thread is about how we do things as Quakers together, how we worship and how we do our business. And indeed, how we believe. That absolute perhaps is a key boundary marker of liberal Quakerism. The second thing to say about this list of 4 things is that I think it's inherently collective. That we've learnt over the centuries that these are things that are best done together. Now, obviously, we can encounter the divine anywhere. And indeed, early friends talked about being taken up into a new space that kind of never went away. They're just sort of taken up and in this amazing intimacy, it carried on day after day. Well, that may not be our experience today, but many of us will have had literally mountaintop experiences, or for me, in the middle of city centres or wherever. It's not necessarily in meeting, but we then come together to worship because there's something particularly rich or strong or more reliable about that intentional sacramentality of worshipping together. We get a richer experience sometimes than we might do just sitting in silence on our own at home for an hour. Something deeper happens when 2 or 3 are gathered. We know we discern better together. Okay, there's me alone with the advertisement. That's very dangerous. Because I could just imagine anything, and I often do, but it can then be tested. I said, well, actually, I'm not quite sure that's a sign, Ben. So, and again, we may have personal testing mechanisms, but together we've found that our discernment is more reliable. It's not about masses of numbers. It's not going to be necessarily way better if it's 100 than if it's 10. But I would say it's going to be better if it's at least 3 rather than 1. So. And we know that our witness work works better when we're pulling together. That it's just going to be stronger. That there's a reason why we have organisations like American Friends Service Committee, or in Britain, Quaker Peace and Social Witness, where a number of meetings can join together and work together more effectively. And the 4th thing about this list, there's lots of lists about lists, don't worry about it. The 4th thing is that I also think this is inherently about transformation. And that's why this evening is called Being Quaker, Being Transformed, and the lecture I gave in Britain was called Open for Transformation, Being Quaker. That if you put a Quaker stall up in the kind of spiritual marketplace, we would say, we are open for transformation. We're open for it personally. That's what we're seeking. We're hoping to be taken into this space that will never go again. Margaret Fell's crying in her pew as George Fox ministers in Ulverston Church, hoping that not nothing will be taken away from that experience, that she will be kept in that place. Well, our spiritual experience now may kind of move more in and out, and we may have those just glimpses of that intimacy or aspire to that intimacy. Not all of us have had some kind of life-changing convincement experience which never leaves. But we are open for that. We come along, I suggest, to meeting hoping for that. To say we can't experience the divine and not be changed by it. So. And then we go out as Quakers and we try and change the world, because that's what we're called to do. It's not a kind of, I'm okay, I'm saved, I'm going back to the farm kind of faith. It's a faith that pours us out onto the streets to do something about the social injustices in the world. We can't just sit and do nothing as friends. So there we are, that's what it means to be a Quaker. So that's fine. And actually, I didn't think there was anything particularly unusual about that, although some British Quakers are a bit wary about transformation, and certainly God. Anyway, though one of the other things I said is we should be unapologetic about our spiritual language. That if we're in a diverse group or in any group, we should be able to speak with integrity, and hopefully other people can learn to translate. And often in Quaker texts, and I've done this myself, there's a little bit at the beginning it says, well, I'm going to use the term God, but that's only me, and please translate, and then we can get the word over with, and then we carry on. And I deliberately didn't do that in my lecture, and that caused a few problems, because some people just suddenly thought, I thought everyone must be a God friend. But anyway, only on page, 156 and a half or something, I said, well, theology is a kind of toward sort of thing, on the words are inadequate to express the depth of the experience. God is not the word for God. God is just what we call. So, anyway. But we should be able to be unapologetic. We shouldn't self-censor. We should be able to just speak our truth. So I laid all that out, and then I said, however, there are some challenges to do with our particular present-day context. And I'm going to just go through a few of those, and they may be particular to Britain, but I suggest some of them will be familiar here as well. And they belong into two categories, and the first is about belonging, and the second is about believing. Well, as Quakers today, we're generally belonging in a very different way from the way we were, say, 150 years ago. And I should say, generally, we're very pleased about all of these things. So I'm not putting these things up to judge them necessarily. But we belong in a different way because the chances are we've come in as adults. And in Britain now, 88% of us have joined as adults. Okay? Typically at the age of 43. Okay, so. So we're no longer kind of necessarily learning our Quakerism over the dining room table or, discussing the business meeting over lunch or whatever. We're not learning our Quakerism as Rufus Jones talks of being, sprinkled with religion from morning to night. We may be growing up with other things, although increasingly that's not the case in a secular place like Britain. So 20 years ago, 50% of people coming into Quakerism had an immediately prior religious affiliation. That's now just 33%. So most people are coming from nowhere now. So, and this will have, I'll talk about some of the consequences of that in a minute. Of course, also, we're no longer wearing the Quaker uniform. Okay? And so, and that's probably, we're probably quite pleased about that. But we're in a sense, from about the 1850s and 1860s, we've decided we can be in the world and not be so distinct. We don't want to set ourselves apart anymore. We can be faithful to our witness without necessarily wearing a particular set of clothes. And there was a whole debate that went on there, and someone was saying, who's going to join if you have to begin your spiritual life in the tailor's shop? And other people were saying, yeah, but if we get like the world, we'll just be so contaminated. And there's this great quote that I always trot out, I would rather die as a dog in a ditch than say you to a single person. You've got to hold on to the thee and the thou, because otherwise it's a slippery slope. Well, in Britain, after 1860, you could be buried with a gravestone, which itself was a major innovation. And you could marry a non-Quaker in the meeting house. And you could wear what you liked. So, this is really significant stuff. Membership went up after this point. And obviously there were fewer disownments for marriage irregularity and dress and things like that. But in a way, Quakerism then becomes much more open to the world, becomes part of the true church rather than the true church. And Britain Yearly Meeting today would say, well, one faith amongst many and none. Actually, lots of paths are valid, and there isn't even the suggestion you have to go anywhere. That's okay. That's your choice. So we've become very individualistic, in a sense, very optional. We've become, as Quakers, an option within the option of a faith position. And I think that has consequences for how we come to meeting. Coming to meeting has become an option. In a way, probably it was less so in the past. 1/3 of people on our lists are likely to come along every Sunday in Britain. And there's a very interesting phenomenon that people formally join, they become members, and then we never see them again for quite a while. Because they've made their commitment, they know they're committed, they don't need to come along. It's very, very interesting, And it happens surprisingly regularly. So I'm suggesting we belong in a different kind of way than Quakers did, say, 150 years ago. And that has consequences for service. So there's me saying yes. If you've discerned in your committee, I'll say yes. Where, now we kind of weigh it up and think, well, I don't know if I want to do that now, and this kind of thing. So we choose again, and that's, realistic given our commitments, or given the number of different nominations committees who might be knocking on our door. So we choose how much to give. And in Britain, our financial giving has been just about holding steady, but fewer people are giving more money. And we have a labour crisis. So we have more, I think it's probably, maybe, I don't know when it kind of happened, but we have more jobs than members, through the yearly meeting. If you add up all the local and monthly meeting and yearly meeting jobs. And so the committed are often doing 2 or 3 or 4 or 8 things. And nominations committees are struggling to find names for these long lists. And people are saying no, or can't do any more, or it's just too much. And so we're belonging in different ways. At the same time, we're believing in different ways. And I talked about this very broad diversity. We no longer have, it's no longer so easy to find a single articulation of what it might mean to be a Quaker, or of what that might look like in belief terms. And that has consequences for how we might describe what's going on in meeting. And then I'm thinking about the inquirer coming in and saying, well, what do you do here? Well, are we worshipping? Are we meditating? What does worship mean? What do you actually do in the silence? And can we then voice a clear, accessible answer to the inquirer that comes in through the door? And what are we doing in meeting for worship for business? And this is probably the really tricky question. Are we discerning the will of God, as is the traditional formulation? Or, well, if your God doesn't have a will, that's a bit tricky. Or maybe God decides as we do. I have a whole will of God flowchart in my office. Like will of God, yes, no. And then if yes, is the will of God like that? Is it kind of a heart we learn together moment? Or does God know at least 10 seconds before we do? And what is the will of God? Is it about big broad brushstrokes? Do peace, sort it out. Or, don't have tea, have coffee, one sugar only. Okay? So, and we have discussions and debates about that. What is the will of God for you? And obviously if your God doesn't have a will, then you don't have a will of God. And if you don't have a God, you don't have a will of God. And one of the challenges, I think, for non-theists is to articulate what might be going on in Quaker meeting for business. You can get cynical responses like, well, we spend a lot of time getting to where we knew we wanted to get to anyway. But, that's not my experience of Quaker business method. Amazing things happen in business meetings. The totally unlikely, the totally unexpected, the totally irrational and wonderfully led decisions that we sometimes come to. So, we then have a problem, though, teaching Quakerism from such a broad base. What do we put on the leaflet? In fact, how do we write a minute very easily? Or what goes into a yearly meeting epistle? We get confused about spiritual gifts. We tend to think of them as, in secular terms, as talents or, skills. And we can see that happening because, people get modest about their spiritual gifts, rather than seeing them as things that are given to us by God to use as part of our ministry. You say, oh, no, I can't, but you're brilliant with it. No, I can't do that. Well, they're not for us to be modest about. It's like ministry and meeting. It's not ours. We act as the channel. Or we fall into the danger of celebrity, which is another sure sign of secularizing gifts. And then we get into trouble with nominations because we forget that nominations is about matching gifts to role. That's what we're trying to do. And it may be we don't have the gifts we need to keep a meeting going amongst the members there. And either we need to pull someone else in, or we may need to lay the meeting down for a while. And I think, that would be fine. Not everyone is called to do everything. Okay, there are some people who should not be treasurer. Okay, and a lot of people would agree with that. We have a passage in the British Faith and Practice about this dear friend who was appointed an elder and felt very unworthy. Okay? So she was questioning the nominations process, but she went to another seasoned friend and said, I feel so, they've asked me to be an elder. It's like, I really don't know if I can do this. And this other seasoned friend said, my dear, we have to take what we can get. So, well, we love that passage, and it's often quoted. And the problem with it is, though, is it leads to lots of people thinking, well, they have to have what they can get. Yes, okay, I'll be treasurer. I'll be useless at it, but they have to have what they can get. Instead of saying we have particular, equal but different spiritual gifts that make up our community. And my calling is in this direction, but not in that. And our nominations committee should be discerning and encouraging and nurturing people's gifts, not trying to get through this long list. I feel for nominations committees, and just trying to put a name against every office. So I'll come back to my solutions to these problems at the end. So there will be answers. Okay. So there's a number of challenges, in a sense, facing Quakerism, particularly because of changes in context around believing and belonging. And in Britain, they're exacerbated by a highly secular culture and a very individualistic culture. So we're used to being consumers. We're used to having choices in just about everything and having agency and even a sense of entitlement that we should be able to choose. And that then folds on into our spiritual life, where we then pick and choose which Sundays we're going and whether we're going to be on this committee or that committee and whether or not we're going to give or not give financially, and what we want to believe and not believe, and the fact we should still be part of this group. So I'm beginning to sound like a grumpy old Quaker who is sort of rather conservative in some ways, with a small c. And that's probably right. So, one of the things that came to me, though, is actually all of the things that I was concerned about are, in a sense, answered by the Book of Discipline. I mean, it's all there. I mean, one of the other things I haven't mentioned is the challenge of what it means to be a member. So, is it okay for an atheist to be a member? Well, I came into Quakerism as a sort of atheist peacenik, and joined too quickly, and was encouraged to join. I was young, and here's somebody great, and and a year later had an incredible spiritual experience. And I suppose the difference is that, we never know what's going to happen to somebody. I still think they should have asked me to wait a bit longer, because I don't think I really understood what I was getting into. But I did also have a very strong sense of contract, that I knew I was joining a spiritual group with clearly Christian roots and, a framing of Christianity. And I wasn't looking to change that. And that might be one of my tests. How open are you? Are you open for transformation? It's not about necessarily what you've experienced or necessarily about the words you use to describe that experience. But are you open for transformation, and are you prepared to help work to nurture that place for others? Actually, we have a very clear section on membership in the British Discipline, and it says that being a member is about saying to yourself and to the world that you accept the fundamental elements of being a Quaker. Amazing. And then it even lists the fundamental elements of being a Quaker. It's really a very radical passage for such a permissive yearly meeting. And it talks about testimony, and it talks about corporate divine guidance. So it's all there. It's like the will of God. Fine. Okay. So it's very clear, really. Do you accept the fundamental elements of being a Quaker? Well, somewhere along the line in our local meetings, we've lost that memory of the Book of Discipline. We're kind of saying, well, if you feel at home here, fine. And there's been about 20, 30 years in Britain where we've been very permissive and easygoing about membership. Well, in my own meeting, we then had two problems in the last couple of years. And the first was someone we let in. We were so pleased to have this person come along and join that we let them in very quickly. And then it very quickly transpired that they didn't really understand Quakerism. Texting throughout meeting. Okay? That's a problem, and it's not appropriate. Okay? But not hearing that that's not appropriate, and not accepting that that's not appropriate, and threatening physical violence when told it's not appropriate. Okay? And in the end, we terminated this person's membership. Somebody else who initially complained to the elders about the clerk and then refused to meet with the elders because they were all younger than he was. I mean, just bizarre kind of, And in the end, with that person, we said, well, I'm afraid we don't feel you're able to represent us in the ways that you do. And we released him from his responsibilities, at which point he resigned. Now, in both cases, we probably were not careful enough in admitting those people into membership. We now have a much tighter process. So we've just, in many ways, facing these challenges and yet finding there are answers already there, but we just have lost track of them. And now, amazingly, the yearly meeting is deciding we should know our book. And we've got a whole calendar of reading through the Book of Discipline that's going to take us through to April 2017. So month by month you get a chapter. And friends everywhere are reading these. So that was the first thing. I thought, well, actually, we know all this already. It's not like we need some major reform or renewal, we just actually need to know what we're about, and we've actually written all that down already. That's okay. But there are some other problems. One is that I think we're not probably serious enough about our faith. And one of the clues to that is just a real lack of humour sometimes. It's we're like weighted down with seriousness of a different kind, weighted down with sort of an ought kind of attitude, or a sort of an earnest piety, or a sense of duty. And what you recognise, and I've had this delightful life where I've swanned around the Quaker world for the last decades, meeting lots of amazing people who are very committed. And you realise there's a lot of humour around, because, when you take something really seriously, and you're taking it seriously, you can then laugh about it, and joke, and be satirical. Because you're not actually wanting to unpick it at all. You hold it so dearly, but you just need a bit of light relief. So. And there's stories of, priests joking in the vestry before going out to offer the sacrament. It's not that they're demeaning the experience. It's actually, I think, a reflection of their seriousness. So I think we could be more serious and have a lot more fun, if that's not too paradoxical. I think we need greater clarity. We need to learn and become better practiced at communicating what it is to be a Quaker. So one of the other problems in Britain is that someone comes in through the door and says, well, what do Quakers believe? We're probably going to give them a leaflet. Or worse, maybe our Book of Discipline, which they kind of have to wade through and of course it's full of our jargon, isn't it? It's like, or we'll start speaking to them in acronyms. AFSC and FCNL and, we're not very good at just saying this is what Quakerism is. This is how it is for me. And we just need to become better practiced and better communicators. And if you look at the language of the leaflets, it's often really complicated kind of stuff. It's not very accessible, actually. So we're kind of protecting our demographic base and enjoying it rather maybe too much. So. And in Britain, the figures are horrendous in terms of how, the level of diversity amongst the group is very low. And in terms of qualifications, is ridiculously out of kilter with the general population. So. But I think there's some other things that we could do just to simplify our Quaker life. And I give the example of the meeting that I joined 15 years ago. And I came from the south of England, from quite a large meeting where the typical format would be you'd have there'd be someone on the door to welcome you, and then you'd come in and large meeting, and someone would make sure the clock was going, and then at the end of the hour we'd shake hands, and there'd be tea and coffee and about 20 minutes of notices, and maybe the opportunity to introduce yourself and this kind of thing. And we had lots of rotors. So we had a list for, is it rotary? Sign-up sheets, thank you. We had lots of sign-up sheets. So for doorkeeping, for flowers, for milk, for tea making, for librarian on duty, for elder to stand by the piano in case anyone wants to ask questions. So I came up north, and just coming up north is interesting. So coming to a small town in the north, and everyone knew everything about me before I even got there, because everyone chats, and the estate agent had chatted, and the realtor, chatted. And there's still moments. I've been there 15 years. My wife has been there, 30 years, and she's still an incomer. Or a blow-in. Okay. Well, there's no hope for me. I don't even speak with a local accent. And our daughter's now bilingual. So she'll say bath and grass to me, and bath and grass to another. So, and there's still times where I just have to say, I'm terribly sorry, I can't understand a word that you're saying. So, okay. Anyway, so come up north to this meeting, and it's a lovely meeting house. It has no foyer. You open the door and you're in the meeting room. It's an old 1778 kind of place. And so there's no doorkeeper, because there's no real door to keep. You just want to keep it shut because it's cold. But they had, no sign-up sheets for anything. But the first startling thing was hour of worship, and then you sit there, of course you're waiting for the 20 minutes and notices. No notices. No notices. Straight into tea and coffee. Stunning. No would anyone like to introduce themselves this morning? There's admittedly only 10 or 15 of us there, but it's startlingly different. And there are no sign-up sheets for anything. So, now admittedly the milk is delivered, that's handy, but lots of people have a key, that's okay, don't need a sign-up sheet for opening the meeting house. If someone wants flowers in the middle, okay, because it's one of these, has a square of benches and chairs with a table. So one of the things that happened in the 1920s in Britain is that we abolished the recorded ministry. So you no longer have recorded ministers sitting up here on the facing bench. And when that happens, you can start to move the benches around into more of a square. And then, of course, people have back problems, so you buy chairs. Could be a slippery slope. Anyway. And you then put a table in the middle, and suddenly there are flowers from about 1930. Okay? It's all innovation. Don't think those flowers are sacred. They're less than 100 years old. Anyway. So, if anyone wants flowers, like we do have a garden at the meeting, and they can go and get some. Okay? At the end of meeting, no notices, they're given out monthly before our business meeting. If people want to drink, okay, here's the thing. The first person that gets to the kettle normally puts it on. Okay, if you want a drink, you will make one. And hopefully, being a good Quaker, you'll make one for everyone else. The only appointments in that meeting are one clerk, and one treasurer. Right? And we're part of a monthly meeting that would then provide us with an elder and someone for oversight. So that's it. Okay, so we're finding, there's 4 people out of that meeting with roles, basically. Other meetings, like the one I'd come from, had about 31 people to nominate each year. Okay? Because they'd have a clerk and assistant clerk, treasurer, assistant treasurer, finance and property committee, library committee, children's committee, peace committee. Okay? One local meeting in Britain has 168 nominations to find each year. Okay? This is crazy. Our numbers are falling. They've fallen by probably 25% in the last 20 years in Britain. Okay, very typical of liberal religion in Britain. Okay, according to statistics, there won't be a Methodist in Britain by 2031, or an Anglican by 2058. Okay, if the graphs carry on. So. But, so let's just change the way we do things. Let's have fewer appointments. We could just do a roles audit. Okay? How many roles do we really need? Not food-wise, just... So, how many people need to serve in a particular way in this meeting? Do we really need to carry on in the way that we have done? Because it just becomes this kind of grind of ought and... So. The other thing is that we tend to enjoy each other's company, and we do lots of things together, and that's good. And we have meetings in cafes and, just hang out together and do practical things together, like plumbing and bench waxing and that kind of thing. So if you ever want a working holiday, you can come to our meeting. So, okay. We need to somehow replace this anxiety that seems to beset a lot of Quaker meetings and this sense of duty with joy, I think. And having fewer things that people ought to do is, I think, one way to find more joy. The most radical thing we've been thinking of in the last 2 weeks is that we'll just sell the whole meeting house. Okay? 1778, it's not like really historic. It looks at Pendle Hill, admittedly, that's nice. But it's not like 1660 or something. George Fox did not go there, if that mattered anyway. And of course, as Quakers, all places are equally special anyway. And it costs an arm and a leg to keep going. It's really expensive to heat. And we now have a curtain that we pull across half of the meeting house where the roof is slightly lower to keep the heat in. And then we have rugs for people who attend worship. So we're coated around in rugs. So any inquirer that comes in, they have to find their way through the curtain. Where's the join? And then they get through the join of the curtain as these people in rugs. Come on in. We're not strange. So we've seen a restaurant in town. So the other thing about this meeting house is it's in the middle of nowhere, particularly. It's like out in the countryside. None of us live near it. It's a historic meeting house in a historic location. But in the town, 4 miles away, there's this restaurant, which would just be fantastic. It's like really nice square space, got a very nice atmosphere. It's got a commercial kitchen. And we know how important food is. And it's got another room the children could use, and it's got an apartment above with a rental income. So, sounds great. And we could be in the middle of town, and we could say, Clitheroe Quaker Centre. And we could be there, and we could have meetings in the evening really easily. It would be warm all the time, and it would be cheaper to run, and it wouldn't be a listed building, which is like special status and a pain in the neck. And, and we could let it to other groups who would then learn more about Quakerism, and we could do lots of exciting things. And amazingly, 5 years ago we made a very clear decision to stay in our historic meeting house and to let out the cottage at half rent to people who might otherwise not be able to afford to stay in the area. And in the last few weeks, we've had this complete sense that it's right to maybe move into town. Okay? And the area that we're a part of has also felt that that may be right for us to do. Okay? No member has raised any issue about this possible sale and move. Really interesting. It's like all the dominoes of, the energy that comes with right discernment are lining up and falling. And we had a threshing meeting on Sunday, though, to say, well, how do we feel about this? And actually, we couldn't get to the meeting house because the roads were flooded. But so we invited everyone to our house, and we had 2 hours of threshing after meeting after a shared lunch. So. And what was interesting is all the members said, I feel really energized by this prospect of a more modern building where we'd be far more visible. And what's interesting is all of our recent attenders said, you can't sell it. We love that meeting. We've come to Quakerism and we sit in the garden, even when there's no meeting. And it's just, And of course, at this point, you realise that Quaker business method might be overrated. And why was that reform anyway in the 1990s about allowing attenders to come to business meetings? But I mean, so that's really interesting because we're kind of stuck. And one of the analyses, and it may not be right, was that actually the members were thinking of the group and what we might do as a group. And the grieving was much more individual. It was about, but this place means a lot to me. And that may be the fault line between the two positions. So we don't know, obviously, what's going to happen. We don't know where we're going to be led. We're going to have a business meeting on Saturday to go forward. But I mean, one of the things I suppose we need to think about as we think about how we might transform Quakerism so that we can really be transforming agents is that we could reduce our kind of baggage. So in Britain we have 400 meetings with meeting houses, half of which are historic and special category buildings. And someone said on Sunday, the meeting house should be the tool of the meeting, not the other way around. Now, we didn't start, we might say, well, we wouldn't want to start where we are to get to where we want to go. If we go back to the 1650s, no meeting house before, 1670s. We didn't need them. They're not important in and of themselves. And probably far fewer committees. Okay? And a much lower budget. Okay? Britain Yearly Meeting employs 120 staff in its offices in London. We have a 10 million annual budget in pounds, so $15 million. That's huge for 15,000 of us. Okay, we're running on chocolate money, basically, like Cadbury's and Rowntree legacies. So I suppose one of the things I want to say is that if we're really to put faith back into the middle, and I think one of the symptoms of a lack of faith is our concern about numbers and this kind of thing, which in Britain is, we're always worrying about numbers. And we're worrying because we've lost faith. Because faith isn't about worry. Faith is about a hope that transcends our imagination. Hope's about not knowing where we will be taken, but being, faith is being sure we will be taken there. And I just think we may need to simplify Quakerism considerably to actually restore our spiritual vitality so that we can become agents of transformation again, and rather than maintenance agents.